I spent a little bit of time in my last video, which, like an idiot, I uploaded on the wrong channel, but it's okay. I'll leave it where it is. Mentioning that I'd made some changes to my game, Dark Fantasy X. And I thought I would talk just a little bit about some of those changes today. And in fact, I thought I'd kind of go through the book. It's long enough, I can't do that in one video, but let me go through some of the basic things and tell you how you do things and why. So, first off, let me just summarize, because the other video is on the other channel. Let me just summarize a few things extremely briefly. First off, I have a game that originally was based on Microlight 20 M20, which is an extremely stripped down adaptation of D20, the third edition D&D rules. Now, I've made a lot of changes to it so it doesn't resemble any particular or specific version of M20 anymore. In fact, I don't think it's a Microlight game at all anymore. So what I have done is I've really simplified the rules. The whole point of it is that it's at least as rules light and very much in the same spirit as original D&D. Probably more rules light even than that, although it doesn't necessarily feel like that. It's not really an old school game. It's got a few modern add-ons or other rules that come from maybe even other games than D&D entirely, because it's not meant to facilitate the type of game that Gary Gygax was running in the 70s. It's a totally different kind of game. It's basically an investigative game in a fantasy setting. So if you imagine something sort of like Lord of the Rings, but the story being told is more like the X-Files, that's kind of what you should be tracking towards. Anyway, let me talk a little bit more specifically about how you do stuff in this game. At its core, one of the things that it borrows from 3rd edition and D20 and everything else that's come since then is a universal task resolution mechanic. Everything you want to do just about involves rolling a d20, adding 2 different modifiers to it, one based on your ability score and one based on your skill, that whichever ones are applicable, comparing them to a target number, or in some cases comparing them to an opposed roll, I guess, but mostly to a target number. There are a very small handful of exceptions where there's no applicable skill and you just do you just use your character level instead. But basically that's the mechanic. You roll a d20, you add these 2 modifiers, and you compare it to a target number. And almost everything in the game can be done once you understand that. So clearly the most important parts of creating a character are creating those modifiers. So there's 6 ability scores. They're the 6 ability scores that you probably recognize from Dungeons & Dragons, although I've tweaked them a little. And then there's 6 skills. And you use a combination of one of each of those for almost everything that you do. So stats, like I said, I've got 6 of them: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. You guys probably know what all of those are by now because they're the same as they are in D&D. One thing that I did, however, is that I always thought that the separation between the ability score, which is very traditional, it's 3 through 18, right? You roll the 3d6s. And the ability score modifier, which is actually the score that you use. I thought that was kind of silly, and I understood that there was a lot of tradition between those ability scores, and people wanted to see ability scores that they recognized. But in reality, in 3rd edition, I don't know for sure about 4th or 5th edition, but I think that's mostly true there as well. You don't actually use your ability scores for anything other than to generate your ability score modifier, which is actually the number that you use all the time. So I changed the ability scores to look like modifiers. Rather than going from 3 to 18, they go from -3 to +4, which is about the same range as various editions of D&D. I think in 3rd edition, if I remember correctly, and it's been a long time since I played that, so I might be wrong, but I think you went from -4 to +4 in the basic range. If you had different races or you leveled up and you went higher, you could go higher than that. But at character generation, especially if you were a human, I think that was the range, if I recall. I think in some of the older versions of D&D, it was -3 to +3. So it's about in that same range. So how do you do that? You roll 7 d8s, drop the lowest one, subtract 4 from all of them, and that will give you 6 scores, and you apply them as you want. Now, this is a little different than doing it the old-fashioned way. For one thing, when you roll 3d6s, although it's only 3 dice, it's still better than just 1 dice. You do get something that approximates a little bit more a bell curve on your score. So you will tend much more often to get middling scores. Now, of course, in most versions of D&D, you actually roll 4d6 and drop the lowest, so that will shift the average up. But you still get kind of a bell curve-like effect, and having really high scores and even more so having really low scores is much more rare. Having kind of middle good scores for most of them, 12, 13, 14 or so, with a handful that are 1 or 2 that are going to be higher or lower. That's where you are for most of your characters. If you roll a d8, subtract 4, you do get a range of -3 to +4, which is about the same as the ability modifier range that you get from traditional 3rd edition D&D. But your distribution will be different because each score is based on a single die roll. And in theory, and I presume for most people's dice this is close enough, you have about an equal chance of getting any of the faces on the die. So you have an equal chance of rolling a 1 as you do of rolling an 8. And if you roll a 1 and subtract 4, you have -3. If you get an 8 and subtract 4, you have +4. But because there's an equal chance of any of those faces of those dies, your range is the same, but your spread, if you will, your average might be a little different. You may have a little bit more swinginess in your scores. And there's no way to do that because, or there's no way to not do that, I should say, because in the other game, if you roll 4d6 and drop 1, you're impacting every ability score roll. If you roll 7 ability scores and drop 1 to have 6, that's a little different mathematically. So that just as a heads up, I actually think that that's a feature, not a bug. I think that D&D characters over time, starting especially with 3rd edition, but this is probably even more true now, have become a little bit too samey for my taste. The rules are designed specifically to insulate you from very much bad luck at character creation, although you don't have necessarily super great luck either. I mean, the idea that you would roll a lot of high scores, that's mathematically improbable. That's still true for me, but I kind of think that it's okay to have characters that have some low scores as well as some high scores. They don't need to all be middle high with only 1 or 2, maybe 1 dump stat and 1 star stat that's is really good. So just as a heads up, that's a difference. So your modifiers will be between -3 and +4 at character generation. It is worth pointing out, however, that obviously characters don't stay where they are at character generation. The ability scores can go up. My assumption for most campaigns I would run is that all characters start as a human. Human get a +1 to all skills. They do not get any pluses or minuses of any kind whatsoever to their abilities. Your abilities are just what you roll. There are some other races that give you modest bonuses to ability scores, and by modest I usually mean a +1. However, when you level up, you can get increases to your ability score at levels 4, 7, and 10. And keep in mind, again, Dark Heritage X assumes only a 1 through 10 level progression. So at levels 4, 7, and 10, you get a +1 to your ability score. You, however, cannot ever increase your ability score higher than +4 plus whatever racial bonus you may have. If you have increases to spend as part of leveling up, but your score is already +4, plus whatever your racial bonus is, you can't increase that ability. You have to increase a different one. If for some reason you've maxed out all of your ability scores, you simply don't get the increase. And, frankly, it's hardly like you need it, you lucky dog. You rolled a character who's improbably good in terms of your ability scores. Skills are the other main arm of the universal task resolution system. Like I said, you got 6 ability scores: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. You also have 6 skills: athletics, bushcraft, communication, knowledge, stealth, and tinker. These are obviously very broad skills. They're nothing at all like the skills of skill-based games like Call of Cthulhu, for example. They're not even anything at all like the skills of 3rd edition, 4th edition, 5th edition, Pathfinder, etc. There's only 6. And so what you do is, rather than having narrow skills that you jack up, you have broad skills that increase very modestly. And because every task resolution roll is a combination of a d20 roll, an ability modifier, and a skill modifier, and There's no rules for what you use. The GM just kind of uses common sense. If you're trying to climb a cliff, 20-foot cliff, and it's kind of rocky and you want to climb it, he'll probably say, well, that's an athletics plus strength check. If for some reason your character says, well, I want to try and have a different approach, I want to like carefully study the cliff and figure out exactly how to do it, make a careful plan, maybe your GM will say, you know what, then you can use a athletics plus intelligence, because you used your intelligence rather than your strength to figure out how to do it. So it's all based on it's kind of how you describe what you're doing versus how the GM describes what the task is, determines which skills and which abilities. So the whole point of these skills is not that they be detailed or deep, but rather that they be broad and frankly kind of shallow, so that GMs can immediately pick a skill and an ability that make the most sense for a task that you're doing, whatever that task may be. And so athletics, obviously that's the skill related to most kind of physical feats. Bushcraft is, again, these are all kind of self-explanatory. Bushcraft is all about, fending for yourself in the wilderness. So if you're tracking some tracks or looking for nuts and berries or hunting an animal, trying to build a shelter in a rainstorm, build a fire, cover your own tracks so people can't follow you, avoid getting lost, interact successfully with dangerous wildlife, scare it off or intimidate it or whatever it may be, those are all bushcraft. And anything that has to do with doing stuff outside is most likely going to be bushcraft. Communication is, again, fairly self-explanatory. It's the ability of your character to interact socially, mostly with non-player characters. Could be anything from giving a debate or a speech, diplomacy, intimidation, trying to convince somebody to give you something, trying to seduce somebody. It could also be something that's, maybe not quite so active. Maybe you're writing a pamphlet that's supposed to inflame the populace against the evil duke or, whatever. So those are all communication skills. They're often combined with charisma, but there could be exceptions depending on what you're doing. Knowledge is the ability of your character to demonstrate or research esoteric knowledge, either through formal education or an apprenticeship or just your own independent study. It's usually combined with intelligence to accomplish a whole bunch of non-physical tasks. Sometimes the GM can also use this to give players a hint if they seem kind of stuck and suggest to them something that their character would probably know if they can make a successful knowledge plus intelligence check. Stealth is, again, kind of obvious, just trying to sneak around or be sneaky or to fool somebody. Often is combined with dexterity if you're sneaking, but it could also be combined with charisma if you're trying to create a disguise or pretend to be somebody you're not or something like that. Stealth plus wisdom is also the check you make to spot if anybody else is trying to sneak up on you or something like that. And then tinker is the last skill. It's just the ability to mess with things. This is where if you want to pick a lock, that's where it happens. If you want to craft something, that's where it happens. A lot of these will be downtime activities, but some of them could also be, hurry, we've got to pick this lock before the sacrifice happens and we got to save the whatever. So there's a lot of different things that tinker can use, and these are this is the basic building block of the game. These abilities, these skills, and a d20. For DC, again, that's up to the GM to decide what's normal. I would say a 15 is kind of a standard default DC. 25 would be a very difficult DC that only high level or very, very experienced or very, very lucky characters should expect to be able to make. Especially at the lower levels, I think you'd rarely be expected to succeed on a DC higher than 20 or so. Then again, if your DC is much lower than 15, it kind of begs the question, why even roll it? I mean, let's assume for the sake of argument that for most checks, you've got a +3 or 4 when you add your ability and your skill bonus. Then, you add a d20 to that, you're rarely going to roll below 10. And really, there's not a lot of tension in rolling these low DCs, so there's no point in making the rolls. Your skill bonus will actually increase. It starts out at +0 for every skill at character generation. However, there's a lot of things that will give you increases to them. There's a lot of character class abilities, or feats, I guess, that will increase your skill bonus. There's racial abilities that will increase your skill bonus. If you're a human, for example, you get a +1 to all skills at character creation. And then if you get a skill expert feat, then you have an additional +2, to your skill check. As you increase in level, also on every even level, you get a +1 to all your skills. So if you get high level, your skill bonus gets to be relatively high. But again, I don't really care much for high level. And even though I chopped the levels in half from D&D from 20 to 10, actually I don't know what D&D is now. It may be up to level 30. In 3rd edition, 20 was kind of more or less the cap. So I chopped it in half to 10. But even then, I don't actually anticipate getting to 10 very often in any campaign I would run. I anticipate that most of my campaigns would advance relatively quickly from 1st to 2nd level. Well, I think most people would consider it slow. It still take at least half a dozen sessions. But then I anticipate that, every level after that, you really kind of camp on it for a lot of sessions, and you really kind of enjoy that level before you move on. So I don't anticipate that we would ever have really high bonuses in any game I would run, even though if you were to get up to 8th, 9th, 10th level, which again, I probably wouldn't, then your bonus would be kind of high at that point. Anyway, it's already been long enough now, and I've probably been a little bit too rambly. When I come back, let's talk a little bit about races and classes, or the equivalents that I have for them in my game, and we'll do that next time.